Good afternoon. We're going to get started. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very pleased that to offer this opportunity in partnership with our with the Public Realm program at the City of Markham, which is a joint initiative between Development Services and Community and Fire Services. I would like to, right off the top, thank Yvonne Young and Brett Lusek, the two, if you could wave, for organizing this and for helping actually keep public realm on the top of Markham's agenda. This is a partnership with the Ontario Professional Planners Institute and the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects. So your attendance is eligible for professional credits. Wow. Do I get those too? Can I get professional credits too? Which is fabulous. Today, we are joined by a group called 880. Does everybody know what 880 is? No? 880 actually worked with us to develop our public realm strategy in terms of helping us with our engagement strategies. And Emily, when I'll introduce her in a little bit more, helped us finalize our plan. But 880 is your public space suitable for somebody that's 8 to 80? So does it do justice? So do you think our public realms and our public spaces satisfy all those criteria? Something for an 8-year-old and something for an 80-year-old. You agree? Can we do better? That's why we're here. So we're really pleased. The organization 880 has been around for a while, and in fact, I actually took the accreditation program when we were talking about it about 3 years ago, 2 days, and it was the hottest days of the year, I think. And we're out walking through Alexander Park, and I used to be the head of Parks and Forestry and Recreation in the City of Toronto. And so when I was walking through it, I was holding my head in shame, thinking, it's gone to pot after I left, because they allowed these big, ugly garbage cans into the parks. And I, to this day, cannot figure out, I know why they did it. It's cheaper. It's all about money. Hopefully today, when you have a conversation about public realm and public spaces, it's not about money. It's about how people use the spaces and how they love those spaces. And sometimes it doesn't need to be a lot of money in order to make it really enthralling and engaging. And so you're going to have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about it. Emily Monroe is from 88 Cities, who is going to talk about animating public realm. And she also talk about some tools to actually create an 880 city, which is our objective. Emily is the executive director, and it is a Canadian-based nonprofit organization that really does promote walking, biking, activities in urban parks, trails, and other public spaces. And in fact, 880 actually, I think your organization is actually in demand across the world. I know you do actually outreach to other countries, and we'll probably share today about some examples from other places. So it's great to have a Canadian organization talking about public realm throughout the rest of the, sharing our experiences and showing the rest of the world what it's all about. I guess it kind of fits in with our philosophy around inclusion and being such an accepting culture and country. So 880 Cities does projects locally, provincially, and obviously internationally. They have created the Doable City Reader, which is a book about, they did it in 2014 at the Doable City Forum in Chicago. So I think there's materials that are available if people would like to have further access to them. Emily's been with 880 since 2009. And has managed diverse engagement projects, which she'll share with you today. She led major projects with the Ontario government, the Knight Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Jarrett Architects. Emily's passionate about making healthy choices for everyone and every day by making cities great places. And that's what we're about too. We believe Markham is a great place, and we just want to make it even better from a public realm perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Emily. And please enjoy your opportunity today.
I think this one's on. All right, thank you. Can you all hear me all right? Looks like it.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Last time I was here, actually, we were doing youth engagement right here in this very room, talking to a bunch of you about the public realm strategy with Brett and Yvonne. So it's wonderful to be back. I love Markham, and I've met a lot of wonderful people here. So thank you very, very much for having me. And as you just learned, maybe some of you already knew, I'm from 880 Cities, and what we're all about, the philosophy that guides all of our work, is this very simple concept called the 880 rule. And we use this kind of lens to look at all of the projects that we work on. We think about how a project might function for somebody who's 8 years old and somebody who's 80 years old. They are an indicator species, and when we talk about thinking with this 880 mindset or this 880 lens, we're not just talking about age, we're talking about every vulnerable citizen. We want to make sure that we create fair and inclusive communities for everybody. Because the fact is that even in the wealthiest and most sprawling communities, up to 1/3 of people don't drive. In Ontario, 14% of people are under the age of 16. And a larger percentage, over 5% of the population over 75 are now not driving as well. So you have about, in any community, about 1/3 of people who don't drive in the city, and we have to find ways that people can access mobility, access public spaces in ways that are safe and comfortable for them. I'm sure many of you have thought of this in the past, but it's something that guides much of our work. It's the fact that streets are really our largest public space. So we have to think about how do we use and how do we design these spaces in our cities. Here's an example that perhaps some of you have seen before. It's how many people you can fit depending on kind of mode. So obviously you can see with vehicles, you take up quite an enormous amount of space. With bikes, much less. And then if you put people in buses or just by themselves, even less, and you have a lot more space to work with. And we know that if we create cities around cars, what we get is more cars. This is something that we've proved time and time again. I don't know when we're going to finally realize that the more we do it, the more we get in terms of cars. And when we design for people, we get healthier and happier and more sustainable cities. This is an example from Times Square in New York. I'm sure many of you have seen the new Times Square or have heard about the new Times Square, but this is a space that has been completely transformed by taking the cars out and initially putting in a short-term pilot project just with paint, some tables, chairs, umbrellas, bollards, and now it's turned into a permanent project. Although there has been some recent controversy, which I won't go into, but maybe some of you know, and I'm sure in your mind you're having a little chuckle about that. So, we are a nonprofit organization. We were founded by this fellow here in terms of a little background information. Has anybody heard Gil Penalosa speak in the past? A couple people in the room. So he is a very, very passionate city builder. He's originally from Bogota, Colombia. He experienced a number of things there that really made him think differently about how we create cities, and he came to Ontario and founded the organization 880 Cities. We've been operational since 2005, and I don't know if anybody recognizes the fellow on the left, but that's Jared Kolb. He's the executive director of Cycle Toronto, and we're very proud to have him in our history. This is our team now. Anytime you meet us, feel free to chat with us. So what do we do? There's a few things that we do. We do unconventional engagement. This is a real focus of our work, getting people out of City Hall and onto the streets to talk to people about how they want to shape and create their city. We also do 880 engagement labs. These are opportunities for people to come up with new ideas for their city. We do a lot of work on open streets consulting, which is something that I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. This was a project that we just implemented or helped to implement in San Jose, California. And we also do public space consulting. I'll just draw your attention to one of the projects because it's a great anecdote. You see the bikes in the top left-hand corner there? That's from Cochrane, Ontario. So Cochrane, Ontario has a population of about 6,000 people. And we worked with them on a project called the Double Neighborhood Project, and they were very inspired by some of these bike share programs that we've seen in cities like New York, Montreal, Toronto, Washington. I mean, bike share programs have sprung up all over the world. But population of 6,000, they certainly don't have the budget to implement a multi-million-dollar bike share program. So they worked with the local police department. The police department donated the stolen bikes that they had found throughout the city. They worked with a group of young people to fix up the bikes, paint them all sorts of vibrant colors, and distributed them throughout the city. And I think 90% of residents in Cochrane were within walking distance of one of these bike share locations. And of course, they don't have the sophisticated security systems that the larger programs have. So when the person who was directing this program at the city was asked, okay, what are you gonna do? All these bikes are gonna get stolen. He said, who cares? What's the worst that's gonna happen? Now somebody who wanted a bike has a bike, and chances are they'll return it at some point or someone will. And that's been what's happened. People have been actually, community members have been collecting the bikes if they've seen them laying about the community and putting them back where they're supposed to be. So it's not perfect, but it worked well for them. And the worst thing that happened is somebody who needed a bike actually got one. So, we do work internationally. We work on a lot of projects in Ontario, but we also work internationally. And something that we talk a lot about and work a lot on is public space or public realm. That's obviously why I'm here to talk to you all today. So how do we know if a public space is working? If we had a longer period of time, I would actually ask you and get your answers for that. But I am going to move on to the way that we try to figure out if a public space is working. This is a quote from Mayor Bloomberg, who was somebody who was quite obsessed with collecting data in New York to make sure that they could prove, actually that's how they made the Times Square project permanent, was they really collected a lot of data before and after the pilot. But he said, in God we trust, all others bring data. So something that we do is we try to look just as closely at public spaces as transportation engineers look at streets in terms of counting traffic. We count people in public spaces, and we look at how a public space is really functioning. So here's an example of a public space that we worked on in Thunder Bay, Ontario. This is a picture of the park, and after we counted at that space probably for 5 days, we had a kind of series of volunteers who were counting people, what they were doing in this space, in hourly shifts. And this was the picture of people, these are estimations, but this was the picture of people that we saw using this space. So as you can see, very, very quickly, it's really mostly younger adults and middle-aged adults who are using this space, and very, very few children and older adults. And this gives us some pretty serious, powerful data to take to city representatives or people in the community to say, you know what, we need to improve this space. There's no kids using this park, and it's in the middle of a residential area. So why is that? And then this is another really critical indicator. We also looked at the ratio in terms of gender. So as you can see, 64% of people using that space were men, and only 36% were women. That is not creating very fair, equitable access to the space. And I'm sure many of you intuitively know that women tend to be a little bit more selective and choosy about their parks and public spaces. Women tend to be much less accepting of kind of mess or a feeling of lack of safety. So having a high proportion of women is a very strong indicator that your public space is functioning pretty well. So this was another tool that we were able to use to begin talking about how the space could be transformed and why it needed to be transformed. So we could see that there were a lot of women, children, and girls missing from that public space. So we know what maybe a space looks like when it's not working. And then the question is, of course, what does a public space look like when it is working, and what are the ingredients? So the things that we talk about are excellent management, consistent programming, and people-first design. And what we mean by that, excellent management, this is Bryant Park. If anybody's been to Bryant Park, it's probably the most meticulously managed public park in the world. It's also one of the richest, so it doesn't mean that every park can be a Bryant Park, but there's a lot to learn from Bryant Park in terms of the management. This is a quote from Project for Public Spaces. They say about 80% of the success of any public space can be attributed to its management. No matter how good the design of the space will be, it will never become a true place unless it's cared for. And that's something that we're always trying to advocate for. If you only have money for design and you don't have money for programming and management, you should probably think about how you're going to take that project on and figure out where you're going to get that additional funding from. And what we always say, this is a picture of the 519 Community Center in the background, is that parks and public spaces we should think of them just like a community center without walls, because really to make a well-functioning park or public space, you need to think about them in that way. That management is about a lot more than just maintenance. It's about a lot more than just picking up the garbage and cutting the grass. It's about figuring out how we can encourage volunteerism and stewardship and make people feel like they're really involved and engaged in the community. It's about ongoing communication and thinking about how a public space can be improved year after year. It's about thinking about different activities and programs that can actually help you to animate the space. Has anybody been to Dufferin Grove in Toronto? A couple people. So Dufferin Grove, this is a fantastic park that you should go to if you ever have the opportunity. It's at Dufferin Street and Bloor Street. And they have so many things going on for the community there. And this is one of the things that they implemented. They are public fire pits, campfires. And everything at Dufferin Grove is pay what you can. It's a donation-based. I think the suggested donation for the fire pits is $20 for an hour. And the idea behind the fire pits was not that people were begging and pleading for them to have fire pits. It was that they wanted to find a way to make sure that the park was active and inviting and engaging in the evening. So really, this was like a way for them to make sure that the park was safe and attractive, and of course it had the spin-off benefit of people loving it. It's one of their most popular features. So you can smell the fire in the evening, you can see that people are there, it adds light. So all of these activities can have many, many spin-off benefits. Of course, management can also mean just providing safety and support and oversight, like at this staff playground in Copenhagen. And there can be different ways of testing new things, and management obviously can play an important role in that. But then there's this other factor of accountability. I certainly know from my experience in Toronto, if I go to a park, it's really impossible to know who would I call if I had a problem at this park. Do I call 311? I mean, I guess that's what I would do. But there's no direct accountability to somebody in terms of who you can ask a question to or who you can express some concerns to. So how can we build that into our park management system? These guys are from Portland, and these are the fellows that are called the park hosts. You can actually get their contact information at the park, and there's somebody that you can connect with if you have some concerns or suggestions. And then another critical factor is finding consistent programming. And this does not mean that the city has to pay for all of these elements. It's about thinking of creative ways to get the community engaged in actually creating opportunities for the community to provide activation and programming. Of course, some things the city has to pay for, but in general, something like this, if you just facilitate a process well, and get people excited about engaging in the public space, you probably have to do a lot less on your own. Having, of course, diverse activities, this is a great example. Farmers markets are always a hit, but then some things that are a little bit more exciting and dynamic and really engage people's senses and creativity. This is an example from Boston. Those are swings, by the way, light up swings for adults. Nobody said swings are just for kids. Another example of something that is not just for kids, everybody in Canada, as soon as I show this picture, their heads explode thinking about litigation. But I think that there's ways we can do fun things like this in Canada too. So this is a trampoline, if you can't tell what it is. It's a trampoline. There's a series of about 5 built right into the sidewalk. And something that I think is interesting is how sometimes things that people think they're creating for kids, like something like a built-in trampoline, are just as attractive to adults, and vice versa. Something like this very simple animation, which is a Play Me piano, you've probably seen them in some cities around the world, are really attractive to people of all ages and abilities. And there's some very creative ways you can begin to animate a public space in the evening and during the daytime, and also all year round. People are usually very attracted to that top left corner picture, which was from Winnipeg. It's a beautiful installation project that they had to create winter warming huts. We had a similar project in Toronto on the waterfront, and it was really great. It was a great way of people kind of helping them to rethink what they can do in public space in the wintertime. Now, this is a real quote from somebody that I talked to in Toronto. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say it was in Toronto, but it was. And they worked for the Parks Department, and they told me, oh, yeah, the sidewalks aren't plowed because the parks are unofficially closed in the wintertime. I mean, that's not the answer we're looking for. We have a lot of winter in Canada, and people like getting outside if there's opportunities to do so. So how can we create spaces that are vibrant and attractive for people all year round? In fact, seniors tend to suffer from very high levels of social isolation in the wintertime, and people's physical activity tends to go down quite dramatically. So we need to do more to encourage people to get it in the wintertime rather than less. And of course, the best public spaces are animated and vibrant all year round. And then the last element that we have to think about is creating engaging and exciting people-first design. This is an example from Malmö in Sweden. They have this beautiful series of themed playgrounds. So they have 37 themed playgrounds across the city. And they're themed all sorts of things. There's like a dinosaur one, a spaceship one, a fairy tale one. And it kind of is, having the themes is what encourages people to go throughout the city and try all of these different new places, because it's not just a replication of what you see in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood. They're really exciting and engaging different spaces for people to go to. We've all seen this before, the difference between design and the user experience. Obviously, this is something we want to avoid, and if we don't avoid it, it's something that we certainly want to mitigate and make sure is fixed in the future so that we can really invite people in the way they want to be engaged in a public space. This is an example of providing really wonderful, necessary infrastructure. It is from a city outside of Mexico City. And a lot of people are concerned about, safety in areas of Mexico City. But these beautiful public plazas, they work and they feel safe for many reasons that you can probably glean from this picture. There's fantastic lighting well into the evening. There's lots of animation along the edges in terms of retail spaces and restaurants and that kind of thing. There's beautiful greenery, which makes people feel safe and like the space is very well cared for. There's music playing. There's places for you to sit, places for you to lock your bike. And as you can see, something we don't have a lot of in North America, or at least in Toronto for sure, and other parts of Canada, are a lot of hard surface, really well functioning public plazas. But they definitely are something that can really, really encourage walkability and getting people of all ages and abilities out. Now, we were talking before about garbage cans. So covering the basics, of course, is very important. Here's 3 pretty obvious examples. We've got public washrooms. I'm sure whoever works in parks and public spaces, you've probably had lots of controversial conversations about whether or not you should have public washrooms or not. It is a difficult conversation because if you can't maintain them, it doesn't always work out so well. But if you want people actually lingering and staying in your public spaces and you want seniors and kids in your public spaces, having restrooms available is pretty critical. And then this is a great water fountain, which also has a doggy water fountain on the bottom. Dog walkers are also a very valuable asset to our public realm because they are always out no matter the weather, in the evening, could be a snowstorm. They're very, very consistent users of our public space. And then probably my favorite example is the bottom left-hand corner. So the thing that really stands out is that pretty beautiful garbage can. It's one of the nicer ones that I've seen. But the thing that I actually think is the most interesting is what you might not notice to the left-hand side. You can see that there's a sign. So on the other side, there's basic information about the park. Well, basic for Bryant Park, so it's probably like knitting night, or free yoga classes, or symphony in the park. Who knows what it is? But on this side, it's actually a photograph of the greenery that's in the park so that visually you aren't distracted by the back of a sign. I mean, that is talking about like really specific detail. Could cost a lot of money, but at least the idea is there. And then, of course, there's the importance of designing around the edges and really inviting people into a space before they even arrive. A lot of parks and public spaces that we go to, it feels like you almost don't even know, you don't know to expect a park to be there until you're actually in it. Whereas there's lots of different ways, many of them affordable and playful, ways that you can engage people before they actually arrive and give them that sense of excitement and arrival. And this is an example from Harvard University. I really like, I'm sure many of you have seen the bistro chairs, the movable bistro chairs in cities. But I really liked these ones because they're a little bit hardier. They had some bench style ones so that you could really play with them, and they're very robust. And we really feel that it's important to find ways to make the community feel like their parks, public spaces, and streets are built by and for the community. This is Pioneer Square out of Portland, and I think it's a wonderful example of a public space. It's literally called by people in Portland, Portland's living room. It's a beautiful public space. It's a fantastic transit hub. And the reason that it's so special, it comes from an interesting background. This is a place that was going to be a parking lot. It was going to be a huge parking structure in the 1980s. The city decided not to follow that fairly terrible idea and decided to create a public plaza. It's now one of the most loved public spaces in the city. When they put this project out to tender, there were lots of kind of starchitects that bidded on the project, and they ended up deciding to go with a local Portland firm, because the firm one night decided to go out and they drew their design right onto the parking lot that was there. So there was a very kind of rich history of how this public space came to be. And all of those bricks that you can see from above, they're all engraved with names of people throughout the community. So there's this very literal translation of the community really being represented in the space. And here's some other examples. This is probably my favorite piece of public art, definitely my favorite fountain that I've seen in the world. This is from Chicago in Millennium Park. I'm not sure who's been there. It's giant, as you can see. This is a giant fountain. There's two huge digital screens, people looking at each other, and they smile, and then they spit at each other, and water comes out, and people can play, kids can play in the spit, which sounds gross, but it's really beautiful and fun. And there's 2,000 people from Chicago that are illustrated in the images. Millennium Park is also one of the most expensive parks in North America. I think the Bean, until last year, was the most expensive piece of public art in the US. But there's some really beautiful examples of how you can also do this quite affordably. So this is an example out of a small town in Alberta. And what they did was they had a portrait artist take pictures of half of the population. I mean, it wasn't a huge town, but still, half of the community was represented in these public portraits. And they were put on walls of like sort of boring walls throughout the city. And this is a really beautiful, reasonably low-cost way you can kind of have the same effect that you saw in Chicago, but on a much more appropriate scale, manageable scale for cities of that size. And then we also want to think about using really unexpected spaces to create wonderful places for people. Maybe some of you have heard about this new project, the Undergardener. So as all of you probably are aware, the connection with the waterfront in Toronto because of the Gardener is pretty challenging. This is a new project to really make sure that there's a safe and accessible and creative way to engage with the waterfront. So ultimately, our cities, our public spaces are really our city symbols of democracy and equality, and that's something that we have to remember in everything that we do related to their planning, design, and management. And this is the part where I'm going to talk kind of specifically about public engagement. So we know that to create a great public space, it's all about people. And it starts with community engagement. As much as possible, we want to engage people in the process of creating their city. But we know that community engagement doesn't always look like this picture, which we chose very strategically. It's like perfectly diverse. Everybody is so excited to be there and they're happy to be together, when in fact, public engagement can be very difficult. I'm sure many of you have seen people acting like this at public forums. It can be very difficult both for the participant as well as for the facilitator and the people on the other side. It can take a very long time, the public engagement process. I'm sure many of you have wanted to pull your hair out over public engagement. It slows things down when you really want to make change in cities, and we very strongly advocate for trying to make change in cities quickly, because we're a little behind the 8 ball, as you probably have noticed. And it can also be very frustrating. This is an example. We worked on a waterfront park project in Kingston, Ontario. That's actually my hometown. And we were like, wicked, this is gonna be great. We're gonna engage all these youth. They're gonna love it. It's this beautiful day. We ordered pizza. It's perfect. And no one came. Not one person. And the lesson was not that kids don't care, because that's the easy thing to think. It's like, oh, we asked them. They didn't come, so who cares? They don't care about this project. Is that we didn't do it right, so we had to try again. And we did. We found different ways of making sure that youth were engaged in the process. And we're able to get some really valuable feedback using a different approach, which I'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, we know that if we talk to people, we probably won't end up with as many spaces like this, which maybe looked nice on paper, but are not very comfortable or functional. Or like this, slightly more ridiculous examples. But if our public meetings look like this, and I'll just let you take a second to absorb this image, but this is what a lot of our public meetings look like. They tend to be older, white middle-class people. That's what we see at a lot of our public meetings. We cannot expect our parks and public spaces and our public realm to look as inviting and youthful and diverse and exciting as something like this. Or like this. This is the children's reading room in Bryant Park. I just realized I have a lot of examples from there. So a couple of our rules of engagement, and we really encourage you to steal any of these ideas. You're welcome to take them all. Is to take it to the streets as much as possible. And by take it to the streets, what we really mean is meet people where they want to be met. Meet people where they're already meeting. Don't get them to come to you, or don't try to get them to come to you, because usually they don't. Find the community hubs, the community spaces where people are meeting. We've met in food courts, we've met in coffee shops, anywhere you can where you know people like to be and they're comfortable. The other thing is you get a much lower proportion of people with very extreme views when you are able to meet a much more sort of general group of the population. Here's an example from Bursey Park, which maybe I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And we also want to really think strategically about being as inclusive as we can. So I mentioned I had those graphs from Patterson Park in Thunder Bay. And this is a session that we did because we knew that the community was really not involved in the planning process. There's a lot of, ultimately, a lot of racism in Thunder Bay and many northern communities. There's a lot of tension between different people within the communities. And there was a very strong perception from the white community that the Aboriginal community were the people that were ruining their park. that was ultimately the way that they saw the situation. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we engaged as many people as possible in the process. And we went to the wet shelter. The wet shelter is for chronic alcoholics. It's for people who will never recover from alcoholism. And we went and we talked to them, and we used the exact same engagement activities that we did with everybody else in the community. We had them create this sort of community wishes banner, essentially. We had them write their ideas for the park on this very large cloth banner. And what we heard, they were the users. They told us, well, oh yeah, we're in the park every day. You know, I'm sorry, I often drink there, that kind of thing. And they had exactly the same ideas that everybody else did. They said they wanted to have kids. They wanted to have kids' playground because there was nothing for the kids to do. They wanted to have more community gardening. They even said that the Christmas decorations sucked and they'd been the same for the last 9 years, which I thought was a very specific and interesting concept. So we talked to them. They really had some very good ideas. They wanted to be engaged more in a lot of things in the park. And then we talked to the community group, or the seniors building that was across the street. So there was a seniors building. They had a common room. That's where we met the people. And we did exactly the same activity with them. We kind of told them, you know, we've talked to a lot of the current users, and they had many of the same ideas that you had. We actually were able to show them their ideas on the banner. And it really helped to kind of figuratively and literally bring some of the ideas together in the community. And then the last thing is we always try to bring some element of play to our community engagement activities. This is, again, an example from Kingston. As you can see, that's unfortunately, I didn't put this slide in, but that it is me hula hooping with a hula hoop around my neck. And we just try to bring something silly and cheap. It doesn't have to be expensive. Bubbles, hula hoops, a little music, and you're kind of good to go. Oh, and free cookies, which we're going to talk about in a second. And we really try to keep the activities, in many cases, as simple as possible, because this makes them attractive to people with language barriers, people of all ages, with lower literacy rates. So we try to keep things as simple and user-friendly as possible. And we try to remember to value people's time. You know, we're asking the community to give us their ideas, give us their feedback, and often they don't get more than a paper survey, which isn't very fun, and it's certainly not going to make you want to contribute your ideas in the future. So we give a lot of free cookies out. We get a lot of free coffee, a lot of free treats. And again, it's really not expensive. This doesn't look flashy. It's maybe not something that is super impressive to people, but it works. It's unintimidating, it's affordable, and you can meet a wide group of people fairly quickly. And kind of our last rule of engagement is to try to leave your ego at home. This is an example of, did anybody go to Open Streets Toronto by any chance? Anybody? No. Okay, next year. You can come this summer. So Open Streets is a program that 880 cities helped to implement with huge support from a really broad volunteer network, as well as a local city champion within city government. So our first idea, open streets are programs where you open the streets to people by closing them to cars. There's great examples, amazing examples in Latin America. One example is in Guadalajara, Mexico. They open 65 kilometers of city streets every single Sunday of the year, and they have more than 400,000 people come out to their Open Streets program. So we wanted to bring it to Toronto. And we started with a very modest proposal, in my opinion. It was 14 kilometers from Withrow Park to High Park along Bloor Street, and then we had this super cool loop around Yonge Street and Church Street. So we went to city staff, and they were like, this is not gonna happen. You gotta tone it down just a little. It's like, okay, so we worked with them and we came up with a slightly more modest proposal. It looked like this. So this was what we did in the first year in 2014. We did Bloor Street from Parliament to Spadina and Yonge Street from Bloor to Queen. I think many people still don't think that this is a very modest proposal, but from 14 kilometers down to 5, it certainly seemed pretty manageable. And by comparison to 65 kilometers, really it was downright small. But testing a project for the first time can be challenging. So we wanted to get this project done. And this was pretty much the only way we were gonna do it, is if we work collaboratively with city government. So we did manage to actually make it happen. We managed to make it happen under Mayor Rob Ford. So that meant we needed to get a lot of public support. We needed to build a lot of political support because we did not have support from the mayor, and he said that very publicly on the news a number of times. And we had more than 25,000 people come out on our first year. And it was because we were able to kind of set aside what this bigger vision was, which we still have. That is still our goal. Our goal is to grow and grow and grow to reach communities across the entire city. But it's something that we will have to do incrementally. So last year we grew again from Spadina to Christie. This year we're hoping to make it to Lansdowne, and we want to connect to the waterfront. And we're in talks now to get over the viaduct. So we're very hopeful that this is a strong foundation and that we have been able to create a healthier and happier city in Toronto. So that is my presentation. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have, but thank you very much. Any questions? All right. Thank you all. Yes?
The open streets thing, we've looked at it here briefly. I sit on the Cycling and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, so we looked at it. First of all, have you had it work in suburban areas, would be your first question, like Markham, if you know Markham at all.
Yeah.
The Candidate Street. And then secondly, my big worry would be lack of activities to do on the street that day, so is there a fair amount of upfront seeding the ground to make it pedestrian attractive even?
So to answer your first question about suburban areas, yeah, we've seen it work in much more suburban cities. We actually just finished a project in San Jose, California, which is a city of about 1 million people, but it's a very, very sprawling city, and very little street life downtown. And the streets, the route selection is really critical. So they selected one, I think theirs was 6 miles, so just over 10 kilometers. And their route, they had one very, very wide, traditional kind of box stores all along the street. That was one section, but that section connected to more of a main street. And it was about split probably 50-50 in terms of this more suburban context of a very, very wide street with strip malls and box stores, and then much more of a traditional main street. And it worked really well. I think something with open streets is that you kind of have to shift your idea of what success looks like. Success isn't people jam-packed shoulder to shoulder. It's a little bit more open. So in San Jose, we had 35,000 people come out to the first program date, which is very good in a city that size, in a place with very little street life, and in a community that's kind of disjointed in terms of how people interact with each other. So we were impressed by that number, and it certainly gave us heart that it's definitely a program that can work in different contexts. I think the thing is selecting those routes is very important, and kind of getting the right combination of places that you want to connect to, places that you want to change the way people think about it, and places that people already want to go, so that you can create that critical mass. And then,
If you don't mind a follow-up?
Yes.
What is the really objective of an open street?
so
One day of an open street, what are you trying to accomplish?
So there's a couple things. First and foremost, we are always trying to create open streets programs rather than open streets events. So even if in the first year you only do one, which I would, if anybody wants to do one, don't do one, do 2 or 3 or 4. But if you only can do one, the ultimate goal should be something that is happening more frequently. And it really serves 2 or more purposes, but ultimately, one is to get people to change the way they see their city and they see their streets, that they can, it helps them to really reimagine how they can get around in the city by foot or by bike. And it kind of is just that shift that streets are a public space. It's as simple as that. So there's that side of it. But then the other part is in a city like Guadalajara, where you have a program that's happening every single Sunday and 400,000 people are coming out, there's a lot of statistics that show that people are actually achieving their pretty significant milestones in terms of physical activity. So when it's a real program, it serves both as a recreation program and as a kind of engagement tool. And then in terms of your question about programming, very, very quickly, we did do a fair amount of programming, but they're pretty spread out throughout the route. So for our 5-kilometer route, we had 5 hubs, so 1 every kilometer, approximately. And these were they were fairly small in parks, public spaces, and some right on street. And we just put out a call for proposals to local partners to get them to animate those spaces for us. Welcome. Yeah. Great.
And so, firstly, building on his question, I wanted to know if you have done any studies and what results those have been on economic development impact of programs like the Open Streets. And furthermore, I wanted to ask about some of your greatest successes or differences that you've noticed in terms of your initial planning team and internal diversity among departmental involvement within a city organization?
Great question. The first question about economic development, there has been some research that's done. One thing with Open Streets programs is that there isn't a lot of research that's like really, really robust research that's based in North America yet. Some of it is from Latin America, but I can point to, there was a very compelling study out of UCLA for the Los Angeles Ciclavia program, and it showed that of businesses along the route, people who engaged in Open Streets programs, they saw a 57% increase in sales. So that means that they were actively engaging with participants, doing something fun. People who were just open on the day of Open Streets saw a 10% increase in sales. In Toronto, our hours the first year were not exactly ideal for engaging businesses. They were 8 to 12 on a Sunday, so many businesses opened after. But we saw either an increase or neutral. So we certainly didn't see businesses losing business. It was either that they stayed the same or there was an increase. And there's more and more economic information coming out, so I'd be happy to pass along anything I have. And then your question about making sure that there's lots of people involved in project planning. That's something that we always try to do as much as possible when we work on projects, is to have planning, health, libraries, community centers, police, fire, all kind of working together and bringing different perspectives to the table, whether that project is an Open Streets project or whether it's a park planning project or a cycling project. Yep.
What happens to the public transit to the closing of the streets?
So one of the reasons that we selected, specifically for Open Streets Toronto, one of the reasons that we selected Yonge Street and Bloor Street was because the subway runs underneath it. Unfortunately, on Sundays, the subway still doesn't open until 9, which is kind of crazy. But I think that's going to change, hopefully, fairly soon. And then in other cities, you divert the buses. For a period of time, which we've had to do a number of times. In fact, in Toronto, actually, for that initial period from 8 until 9, we have to divert the Yonge Street and the Bloor Street buses. And definitely one piece of learning that we've had is to make sure that we have really good volunteers who know where those diversions are, because our goal is to make the lives of transit users, pedestrians, and cyclists better, not more annoying. And the first time that we did it, I would say we didn't have enough kind of support there for people who were taking transit. So that was something that we certainly learned, and we beefed up the presence of people saying, okay, you know, we can show you where this is, where the diversion is. Any other questions? Yeah?
There was that one slide that you showed that the park was being used by, what, 64% men
Yeah.
and very low women.
Yeah.
What did you do to help change that?
So that was actually the other example that I showed with the people at the wet shelter and then the seniors. That was all part of the same project. So we came up with a project report and a kind of community-based vision. The person in the Parks Department that we were working with is still trying to find the real money to make some, it really needs some fairly serious infrastructure upgrades in that park, but there has been some programming related stuff that has happened. So, you know, storytelling sessions, some fitness classes, that kind of thing. But ultimately, that park really needs quite a significant overhaul. One of the first things actually that needs to be done, there's a big blue fence that's around it. And of course, it was put up in the 80s, thinking that somehow the fence would keep people out. And all it did was create this zone where the people that were using this space really make it feels like it's theirs only, and people are afraid to go through it. So the first thing is like, get that fence out of there. Which the police department, so they've had a number of very serious incidents in that park. And the police actually wanted to be the ones to be able to like physically remove, like have a party to rip out the fence because they saw that it was such a barrier. And yeah?
Do you have any examples you could speak about where there has been the kind of engaging contemporary design you described, but in a heritage district or in a location where there are very strict heritage bylaws?
It's a good, I might have to think about that one. An example I can think of, but I'm not sure how closely it was related to the heritage concerns, was in Kingston, Ontario. They have Market Square, which was a parking lot for many, many years until just a few years ago when they transitioned it back into a real market square. And then in the wintertime, it's also a skating rink. But that's something that I could think about and see if I have any examples, because sometimes it is challenging. Other comments? Yeah.
Emily, would you give us an idea of how typically a project gets started? Who start with an idea? How do we get support and funding and all that?
Sure. So we have worked on projects that come from two different sides. So sometimes we do a fair amount of grant-based work. So we apply to grants. In the past, we've had a number of sort of seasons of funding from the Ontario government. Right now, we're working with Knight Foundation in the US, where we have a funder, and then we can work at a very low cost for either a community group or a municipality. And in those cases, often we're sort of building from the ground up. So an example would be the project that we did with Bursey Park. Bursey Park, some of you might know, it's where the Flatiron Building is in Toronto. And we got this grant to work with the BIA there to create a community vision for the park. When we first started working on the project, there was about $250,000 allocated by the city for kind of minor upgrades to the park. But as a result of the project, and really this very much a ground-up approach in that case, they increased the budget to about $4 million, and they're doing a complete overhaul with a really wonderful architect who's very like whimsical and playful, which is something that I think the City of Toronto needs. So we sometimes are able to go that way, and then a lot of times we're hired by a city to support them on helping people to think differently about what the future of their city can be and engaging people in that planning process. So right now we're working with the City of Victoria because they want to implement a minimum grid of separated cycle tracks. And that's you probably all are aware that cycling projects can be pretty controversial. So we're sort of there to work on the engagement side and to get people excited and engaged in the project. Last questions? Okay.
Any more questions? So on behalf of City of Markham, thank you everybody for coming to this lecture today. And if you haven't already done so, you can
sign in at the front. This lecture is still eligible for OALA and OPPI professional development credits, and we also have some light refreshment out for your enjoyment. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, this is very interesting.
Yeah.